would like to introduce our first speaker, which is Gunilla Öberg from Vancouver, and as I learned earlier, also from the University of Bergen. And she's going to talk now. She's going to talk about bridging the divide between scientific practice and studies thereof to support undergraduate teaching and epistemic knowledge. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. So, changing topic a bit, and I think I will cut this a little bit short because we're late in the afternoon. But I will talk about science education. And as we've heard, this is because it's argued that the way we teach science is one of the reasons that we're having these problems that we have with alternative facts, etc. By tradition, science is taught as facts, as a deliverable of irrefutable facts. And when media reports about conflicting findings, this is taken as a sign that science is either fraudulent or it's incapable. In science education, there's a lively debate about how to handle this, and it goes under the name nature of science, or how to teach nature of science. There is also considerable support from philosophers such as Heather Douglas up there, but it's also been written quite a bit. There was a report from the National Academics of Science in the US that stress that we cannot just teach. Science literacy is not a question of content only. It's also a question of understanding that science is a process that is impacted by, for example, its context. Funding, national interests, gender, and all these things. In response to these challenges, UBC, where I work in Vancouver, Canada, they developed a course in 2010. I was not involved in the development, which would have been fun, but I wasn't. I wish I could take credit for that. It's a very writing-intensive course, and there was 3 reasons it was created. One was this call to be able to teach science literacy beyond content. Another is that scientists usually are very bad at writing. A third reason is that science courses are often up to 300 students. Many students move away from home the first time they're away. So there's a lot of health issues, social health issues, mental health issues during the first years. So this course was designed to address all those 3. It's a very writing-intensive course. They write a lot. It's only 25 students in each class. A science professor, every department in the Faculty of Science has to deliver 1 professor. And each professor teaches a group of 25 students during the whole term. They reflect on what science is and how it is done. They learn how to construct and deconstruct scientific arguments in their own papers. They provide peer review to each other. They read peer-reviewed papers. They pick them apart. They become quite advanced. Talk about the role of evidence. This is the first term at the university. And there, at the end, we get to questions about science and society. And the course, from the start, has been very popular among students. They love it. But in some academic quarters, it's been really heavily criticized. I was brought on board in 2011, asked to teach one of the sections. I loved it. I have to admit I was among those that criticized it because the part about science and society was not as strong as the rest. And I was given the opportunity to take care of the 5-year revision of the course. And I started by doing a walkabout, talking to other professors, the heads of departments, etc., asking what's good with the course, what's not so good. And among the things that came up, there were a number of different things, but one of them was kind of this double-faced, Janus-faced image. One was a lot of people being really annoyed with what they called abstract philosophical fluff. Throw that out. Gunilla, throw that out. Whatever you do, don't keep that crap. On the other hand, there was just as strong voices, or even stronger voices, I would say, that say it's really, really important that students understand the science as a process. They also have to understand that peer review is not bulletproof. It is the best we have, but it has tons of problems. There's also a question of the funding. I mean, we know much more about malaria than dengue, just because the simple reason that English people got sick of malaria, not from dengue. Gender issues and all these context-dependent things, they stressed. So they were really concerned that students learned philosophical matters, but they didn't want to have philosophical matters. I was given the opportunity to hire a fantastic co-worker who is both an anthropologist and an instructional designer. And what we, after half a year of asking and talking to people, was quite clear that this divide between what scientists think about science studies and what they think about what they do, we have to find a way of bridging it. And we set out to do the revision, and instead of throwing out the philosophical fluff, we hid it. We put it in quite carefully, and we identified 4 components that seems to be quite relevant, and our study is more, we did a study in parallel with this, and I would say it's an exploratory study. But one is to be very, very clear about the learning objectives and tie that to epistemic knowledge acquisition. Also, a very careful selection of historic and contemporary cases that helps to illustrate these things that the students can explore together with the faculty members. And a systematic scaffolding of the courses. Scaffolding is one of these pedagogic terms, but it means the way you educate your kids. In the beginning, you hold them very carefully, you give them a lot of support, and as time goes and they grow up, you give them less and less support, and then they can fly. So sort of the same way, but thinking about the instructors who don't have any background in philosophy of science because they're scientists, they haven't had time to read up on that, but in the practice they know about it, so if you provide support, they can talk about these issues and explore them with the students on their own and on the conditions of the students. And then conscious attention to vocabulary. And I gave a talk of the initial findings over in Bergen 2 years ago, a year ago, something like that. I got really good feedback. And what was clear was the question about vocabulary. We called it language. After that seminar, we called it vocabulary. There's a number of words that a lot of scientists react very strongly. Epistemology. In science education, people talk about the nature of science. And a very common comment I got from people was, the nature of science? What is the nature of science? What's the nature of anything, by the way? What would that mean? Just take it away. So we're talking about what science is and how it is done. And we have tried to clean everything from any kind of philosophical jargon, but we talk about these matters anyway. And the course was launched, and it's still very, very popular with the students, and the instructors also like it. There's still a few critical voices, but not at all in that respect, and it's not about the philosophical fluff, it's about other things. We were very proud of our paper. We wrote out our experience, and we sent it to one of the top journals in the field. I've been writing papers for 30 years, gotten quite mean critiques, I'm used to that. And I got this one back, which was kind of surprising. Because of the aforementioned issues, it seems unlikely that the manuscript could be revised in a manner that would make it presentable. At this time, you are under no obligation to JRST, and we cannot recommend or accept resubmission. Whatever you do, don't bother to come here again. Like, can it be said any clearer? Doesn't matter what you do, this is crap. And this is weird. So we started reading up and checking, who are we citing, and who is this Abdel Hayek? And we stepped in the middle of a huge conflict. There had just been a conference by a group in Canada, actually, and we traced it back to a paper that we cite a lot by Wong and Hodson from 2009, which is called From the Horse's Mouth. And they are interviewing a large number, not a large number, but a number of scientists about their perception of science and what it is and how it should be done. And they see that when they're given a safe environment, they can reflect on these issues. They're not educated about it, but they can reflect on it. And in science education, which mainly is done on education for teachers, high school teachers, there is a dogma that says that when there's a conflict between the philosophers and the scientists, the view of the philosophers prevail. Ignore the scientists because they don't know what they're doing. The strongest proponent of that view is the editor of this journal. And he wrote a commentary to this, The Horse's Mouth, which said that these people don't know what they're talking about. We cannot give the voice to the scientists. They should not be the ones who are telling us what it is because they don't know what they're doing. There was a response from Wong and Hodgson, and then there was another response, and the papers are really interesting to read. And then there was a conference in the fall where 10 people chopped the head of Eda Abdelkhalik and saying that he's an old fart, he doesn't know what he's doing. And our paper is citing Wong and Hodgson all the way through. So we said, okay, what do we do with this? Diplomacy is not my strongest side. But they are talking, 99% of these papers are talking about when you educate teachers for high school, what should you do? Well, we say in the paper that this is an interesting conversation, and that might be important when you're educating teachers. When you're at university and the scientists are the ones doing the teaching, it's kind of hard to tell them to ignore themselves. So we're saying that as diplomatically as we can, and we're pointing out that this is a sorely understudied area. Surprisingly, no one has really asked the question, so how should you do it? What you normally do is that you bring in the philosopher, and you have the philosopher talk to the students. In the worst case, the students come out and think that the science professors are really stupid because they don't know what they're doing. Or they come out thinking that the philosophers don't know what they're talking about because it doesn't make sense in relation to what they learn about science. And we do not bridge the gap. And if we want to make any progress when it comes to these questions, about to really handle the big challenges we have to have the scientists on board. And the future scientists are today's students. And we have to figure out ways of teaching our students in a way that makes sense. And we have to be able to ground it in solid, rigorous philosophy studies, which of course I include all the PNS research. So that's what I had to say.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, I had one more comment. Day before yesterday I got an email, so the paper is now accepted in another journal.
Okay, thank you. So we move on and
yeah.
have a plan afterwards.
Do you want to go down?
Good afternoon, I'm Cinzia Colombo from the Mario Negri Institute in Milan. And now I'm going to talk about patient involvement and to discuss with you some topics that have already been discussed this morning, but in the field of clinical research mainly. I would like to make a conflict of interest statement. I have no financial conflict of interest in relation to this presentation, but I have a sort of professional conflict of interest because I work in a laboratory called the Laboratory of Research on Consumer Involvement. So what I'm going to say is started from my experience in my laboratory. So what is it, patient involvement? As many of you knows, there are many ways to define patient involvement, depend on the setting, stakeholders, and so on. And so you can see a paper that defines a sort of taxonomy of patient involvement. I don't want to go through all the listed words and labels to say that, just to say that if you take part in a clinical trial, you are called a participant, but if you are involved in the design, for example, of in the design of a clinical trial, maybe you are being involved and not called as participant. So there is variable funding and support, many of you knows, and we already listened to people talk about this. So many program and Institute of Research in many countries funding projects to involve patients in clinical trials. Of course, with variable funding. In Italy, for example, we have just a SHA initiative by the Italian Ministry of Health within its grant, public grant. And these are some examples on how patients are involved in clinical trials. I would like to show you the example from a research group that is called James Lind Alliance. James Lind Alliance is an initiative made by researchers that put together patients and clinicians to ask to ask them which priorities they consider important to be studied in their clinical research, and the National Institute of Health Research then funds this kind of studies. So they put together point of view of patient and clinician and say which are the areas you consider important in your field, in your disease. Because it turns out, of course, that clinical studies are done on topics that are not those considered important by patient or clinician, but those are considered important by researchers or funders, so pharmaceutical companies. Medical journals, just to give you an example, the British Medical Journals has 3 patient editors that review some section of a journal, and when you submit a paper to the B&J, you have to say it is a mandatory requirement. You have to say when, how, and if you involve patient in your study and your research project. We have already heard about this from the side of activists and also patients. There are some examples and many examples. I'm showing you the example on HIV. So these are groups that meet pharmaceutical industry and discuss together a protocol of studies. For example, discussing the inclusion criteria for patients in the clinical studies. And another example is patients like me, but you have already heard about it this morning. So. This is a group of people putting their data in this web platform, and they say that we want to help companies accelerate the development of new solutions for patients. I would like to underline this kind of things because I think that they are, in a sense, I should say in a narrative, I don't know if it's the right word, but to say that they want to faster access to drugs and to new drugs, and so they boost for this kind of actions. A very brief and very simple overview of what is patient involvement. So, of course, the top-down initiatives, the fact that many institutions fund this kind of initiative, the fact that the European Union called for projects in which you have to say you involve patient is a way to boost patient involvement and also to increase the awareness that among the researchers, at least in my experience, are not so aware but not also so available to involve patient, for example, in the design of a protocol and discussing some critical phases of study design. And so they boost this kind of initiative. Of course, the risk is that they become only formal things. So today when you have a panel and you have to discuss some clinical issue, you have to have a patient on board. And you start saying, well, where should we find a patient, a suitable patient fit for purpose? On the other side, the initiative by activists and patient groups, of course, a bottom-up approach, they speak for themselves, but the risk is that they are completely in the same, I should say, context that demands for more drugs, more tests, more exams, so they do not always have a critical view on what it's to develop a clinical research and the aim of funders and the promoters of clinical studies. So what is a good patient involvement? So also for patient involvement in clinical research, there are some checklists, guides, and also reporting checklist. For example, the B&J support this reporting checklist. When you say I involved my patient in my clinical study, you have to go through all the items that this checklist present. So what is a good patient involvement? There are a systematic review on this. They say, okay, that the study available are very variable, so there is scant evidence on what is a good patient involvement, but how we should measure this. We should measure the patient involvement with the satisfaction of people involved, or if change the process or the outcome of the panel, for example. So these are some points that are discussed to assess what is a good patient involvement. And then I came to the Cochrane Colloquium in Edinburgh this year. And the Cochrane Colloquium this year, the Cochrane has a group of consumer, historically, that is the Cochrane Consumer Network. They work with consumer, and recently they involve consumer also in the definition of the priorities of systematic review. And this year they made a patient-included colloquium, so the program was shared with some members of the Cochrane Consumer Network. And I attend to the speech of this lady, that is Jennifer Jones, that talk about patient involvement. She's a bioethicist, but she's the mother of a baby who had a rare disease. And she talked about patient enterprise and patient engagement enterprise. So I would like to use her word because I think she was very precise in underlining the things that we are talking about, and that in clinical trials and clinical research are also important to discuss. So she say in patient engagement, the first demand is for more patient engagement. So now it has become a mantra, sort of things you have format to do, and so you ask for more patient engagement and stop. Institutions don't open their doors to protest. So, as we said, they don't want to be held to account, to criticize. So when you put a patient at the table, you don't want a patient that criticize you and give you some problems and troubles. Patient engagement is managed through sophisticated mechanisms, communication and control, so to neutralize the effect of different voices put on board. In patient engagement, so there are the institutions that create the condition, frame the questions, select and socialize new recruits, and decide who gets heard and who is excluded from the process. So she was saying exactly what I was thinking about, and so I think it was, for me, it was very interesting to hear her voice. But she said also that engaged patients themselves are among the biggest proponents of patient engagement, because nowadays we can assist to this fact that patient as considered as become expert, not only in terms of the competencies related to their experience, but they are trained, so they attend to training courses. Most of them are funded and organized by pharmaceutical companies or with the involvement of pharmaceutical companies. So they are trained, they are certified, they are experienced, where they are well connected because they knew very well all the stakeholders, research institutions, pharmaceutical companies, public entities. So if you put this kind of patient at the table, you put also all a network of relationship with other stakeholders. They're able to act and speak as peers, and they are very effective. So if, as a researcher, I have to organize a panel with patients, I would involve this kind of patient because less time is required for involving. The process is easier. The people at the table speak similar languages. Okay. And so also patient groups are very asked for roles and involvement in different levels. The regulatory agency on drugs, health technology assessment agency, panels on clinical guidelines, they want patients on board and ask for patient groups to be member of these boards. But many patient groups are becoming a sort of company because they are trained for advocacy and lobby, and they are trained also for leadership roles. Of course, they are experienced being part of committees and boards, so I don't say that are all bad things, but I say these are issues to be considered when you involve patient groups and you say, oh, you put a different voice at the table. And as I said, they have relevant relationships with other stakeholders. So now so I look at the literature on the clinical side, I would say. Many articles now deals with an effective research partnership. And so as you say, there are some skills, some things that they list to do an effective research partnership. So methods, processes, skills, resources. Now I'm recently, and my occasion to know the post-normal science, let me think about this kind of things. Are these become a technical solution? Are only this formal solution? Is it possible to make it in another way? And So these are my final questions that is an authentic involvement possible only if it is called for and driven by patients and the public, and so not presented, not asked by researchers, for example, as we are in our institute. Is an authentic involvement feasible in contents or setting, for example, Italian contexts, where people in daily clinical practice and in their daily living are not told exactly often which are the benefits and harms of the treatments they take or the harms of the attacks they do and they receive due to cultural background and asymmetry in power. And where are the boundaries of the demands by patient and patient groups, if there are any boundaries, when they ask for more drug, more treatment, more exam, and to have faster drug access without critical appraisal of, for example, of the drug process regulation, so with the risk to be influenced by commercial interest. And finally, is it possible to avoid a like-minded people approach? So these are my questions, that are all questions that you know very well, but I would like to transfer them in the clinical setting and clinical research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That he is friendly. Well,
no, I mean,
the program...
I'm living in Barcelona. Yeah. Not originally, or
you are
Catalan adoptive. Yeah. Okay, so I'm reporting on a research contract which I've been working last year. It was a research service framework contract for the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, the Institute for Health and Consumer Protection of the JRC. And this institute, they were elaborating models precisely of health economics evaluation related to lifestyles and nutrition. And they asked us to perform a sensitivity auditing or the modeling activity, as well as to bring some other elements such as a global sensitivity analysis. So what is health economics and what are lifestyle economic evaluation? So they are based on analyzing the cost and the benefits of implementing policy options about lifestyles, for instance, options to promote physical activity, to be more physically active, as well as nutrition. Eat less meat, eat more vegetables, more fruit, or policy about totally banning artificial additive, such as industrial trans fatty acid, which are used in many processed food. The implementation of these policies implies some costs for correctly labeling food cans, and so forth, as well as inspections in the food processing companies, as well as expenses for the food companies to change the processing. On the other hand, the implementation of these policies would bring some benefits that are generally estimated in terms of avoided daily disability adjusted life years. That is to say, both numbers of avoided premature deaths, as well as avoided disability due to the disease contraction. So basically, a monetary value is attached to human life. So you estimate the cost that one would incur when implementing a given policy, and on the other hand, you estimate the benefits that you get out of the implementation of this policy. It's a classic cost and benefit analysis. So why is this a post-normal problem? Why is this sort of problem a problem where facts are uncertain, values are in disputes, stakes are high, and decisions are urgent? Well, the evidence that underpins this model is quite uncertain, because everything, for instance, the intake depends on surveys, on nutritional surveys, as well as behavioral surveys. I'll get back to this point later on. Also, the epidemiological evidence may be quite uncertain. The physiology related to the intake, to the dose intake, and the occurrence of the disease may not be known or only partially known. Well, the values may be in dispute because, once again, as I said, it's not a secondary problem. We are attaching a value, a monetary value to human life. And why is it an urgent why it's a problem calling for urgent decision and where are the stakes high? Because non-communicable diseases are 70% of the diseases worldwide. Of course, they are not only due to nutrition as well as lifestyles. I mean, there are also pollution and so forth that do play a role. But it's the toll is 40 million deaths per year. And especially, yeah, also many people, like 2 million people per year, according to the most recent estimate of the World Health Organization, are below 30 years of age. And 50 million people are in the range of 30 to 69. So what we did was applying the lenses and post-normal science lenses on this modeling activity, the modeling activity that was undertaken, and precisely a tool of post-normal science inspiration, that is to say sensitivity auditing. Sensitivity auditing, for those of you that do not know it, is a 7-point checklist that is aimed at checking the normative framings of a model. This checklist consists of the following points. Point 1, check against rhetoric use of mathematical modeling, adopt an assumption hunting attitude. I mean, that's already in the talks this morning, the issue of assumption and the issue of hidden assumption, like was already cited in a couple of talks. Dictate pseudoscience. Pseudoscience, it is to say garbage in, garbage out. So I put garbage in my model, and I get, of course, garbage out of my model. And find sensitivity assumptions before they find you. Point 5, aim for transparency. Point 6, do the right sums rather than the sums right. Point 7, focus the analysis. If you want to know more, for instance, a bibliographic reference is the 2013 paper of Andrea, Angela, Jeroen, and Silvio. What do I make of your Latinorum? So let's start to go through sensitivity auditing, and let's start to see what we could see in the modeling practices by adopting this post-normal science lens. Check against rhetoric use of mathematical modeling. So health economics, at least in the lifestyle models and nutritional models we went through, like a specific typology of model. There are Markov chain Monte Carlo models with transition probability states. Well, there is a problem that these models are quite computationally intensive. So when we asked, is there a precise reason why do you use this Markov chain Monte Carlo model and not a model based on differential equation that would still be able to deliver without so much computational complexity at such cost? No. I mean, it's tradition. Simply the category of health economics decided to go through Monte Carlo models as a model in practice without having a reason, a specific reason for that. And they keep doing this. I mean, that's the way, that's the common language, that's the lingua franca that is spoken in their journals. Then we have seen that sometimes also dose intake, how to model dose intake, maybe not so. What is model is that the model is mostly opportunity driven. I mean, you model what you can model rather than question driven. I mean, question driven, that is to say, driven by the boundary of our ignorance. And for instance, a promising approach may be the approaches that are undertaken in the fields of engineering on environmental modeling to practice model validation and verification. Adopt an assumption hunting attitude, point 2. There is a problem again. I mean, sometimes this model really adopts the ceteris paribus assumption. That is to say, I implement a policy, so you have consequences. I mean, like you ban a certain nutrient, or you implement a policy and you produce the change in lifestyle or the change in nutrition immediately, and all the rest is the same. I mean, the effect to have rebound effects or having the system readjusting differently is not contemplated in this type of model. Then, moreover, another heavy assumption is the representativeness of the sample. You know that population is heterogeneous, and again, how the nutrients content is taken by typology of food. This applies to nutrition surveys. What is the time lag in those intake and response? about the physiological mechanism, moreover, that there is a linear simulation of intake and health response, while there may be present high non-linearities in this case. And then again, what is the number, sometimes the number of years to simulate our policy derivatives effect is something that is not included either. Once again, a very important thing is about the time frame of the model, because once you set the time span that you're analyzing, you may come across completely different conclusion, whether depends on whether you put the end line of your model. I mean, like, you may totally miss the development of a certain disease, or on the other hand, you might overrate the effect of a certain nutrient on a certain disease, dependent on the number of years that you analyze. The point 3, detailed pseudoscience. I mean, here we directly go for a suggestion. We post-normal science, a tool of post-normal science inspiration is the NewsUp. So NewsUp stands for numerical, unit, spread, assessment, and pedigree, a system for the communication of uncertainty, of epistemic uncertainty. Jeroen might tell you far more about NewsUp than myself. Also, in this case, I mean, a way that health economics could take from the post-normal science tools would be, for instance, to adopt a NewsUp approach to evaluate the quality of evidence available in their modeling activities. Find sensitive assumptions before they find you. I mean, that may be surprising. We speak often about deterministic models, and I have 5 minutes left. Okay, cool. Deterministic models and models that, on the other hand, account at least for the stochastic uncertainty. What it happens is that uncertainty analysis is not a wide practice as we might imagine. I mean, what is the uncertainty of the quantitative figures that you are producing? So uncertainty analysis is not run in many cases. Aim for transparency. There is a problem. I want to see your model. I want to have access to it. I want to play with it. I want to understand how it works. So sometimes the model is not only not open, but we come across a model on child obesity. Okay, so we understand that we cannot run ourselves, but could you run it for us? Well, it's 2,000 euro for running session. Okay, cool, fantastic. Next time, thanks. And even like that, I mean, like I said, in many cases, models are just proprietary models based on proprietary softwares, or sometimes not particularly user-friendly, like based on macros that might be embedded into Microsoft Excel or not so accessible. And unless one may have access even to the step of validation and calibration of the model, I mean, it still is like Greek. I mean, there is no understanding. So in this end, like, I mean, the recommendation that I can, some suggestion that can be provided of the community of modelers, programmers would put forward is just, okay, but adopt an open programming language such as Python, R. And it's quite interesting also to adopt maybe interactive widget that may be useful for a stakeholder engagement process, that so actually people get the chance to play with the numbers and see how this affects the outcome, so to have their own involvement, I mean, to get a better understanding of what the model does. Then do the right sum. I mean, here is problematic because, as I said before, we are running a cost-benefit analysis, so we are attaching a monetary value to human life. So, but are we sure we can trust this reduction of the monetary proxy? I mean, there may be so many dimensions that are not included, such as cultural, ethical dimension, and how can one grasp the citizen sentiment toward a certain type of food or toward a certain type of lifestyle. So, I mean, in this case, another tool of post-normal science inspiration, quantitative storytelling, allows to check for the normative framework of this cost-benefit analysis quantification, and may allow to spell out actually the potential plurality of frames that corresponds to different social actors. Or even ethics of quantification may be another option, like someone when may decide to acknowledge the dimension of power and trust, the responsibility that derives from the act of quantifying. So one may choose to refrain from quantifying when the conditions do not hold. For instance, if the uncertainty is high, if the data are not representative, and so forth. Then there is the 7th point, which is about sensitivity analysis, the most quantitative, but keep it simple. I mean, like, that's my favorite, as I'm a number cruncher myself. So sensitivity analysis is not widely, is not an activity widely undertaken in health economics. And sensitivity analysis means to approach on the output uncertainty, so the stochastic uncertainty, the uncertainty that you can measure, onto the input parameter uncertainty, basically. Even when sensitivity analysis is run, there is a problem that is run one variable at a time. So you keep all the parameters fixed, and you just vary one. But there is a problem that you miss higher order interaction in this way, so you do not properly explore the option space. If you have models with no linearities, I mean, and in the field of epidemiology and so forth, no linearities are far common. That would mean that you would miss in your modeling activity a catastrophic effect. Basically, you would not be able to understand that and to what factors this effect will be due. So like we said, as I said, is mostly they are run just varying one variable at a time. We have seen in a Scopus search that one variable at a time is 20 times far more common than a global sensitivity analysis, that when you vary all the parameters together and you actually sample more widely the input space. And even when it's done, it's sometimes the global sensitivity analysis still has some caveats. In this case, it may be interesting the combined use of global sensitivity analysis to understand the stochastic uncertainty and to combine these two with NewsUp, so to understand that where the epistemic uncertainty resides, because actually, I mean, this would allow to flag up very critical situation. Let's assume that the parameter that is most influential on the output uncertainty is the one having a low NewsUp score. So, I mean, it affects a lot the uncertainty on the output, and well, what I know of the parameter, the quality of evidence I have is not particularly good. So, I mean, I may need to revise something in my model, maybe. I'm done. I just have the last slide. Very well. Yeah, I just have this last slide. I will steal 45 seconds, okay? Yeah, these are just basically the conclusion we came across. So, but when engaging with our colleagues at JRC, I mean, they said that sometimes they are asked to quantify a gunpoint because policymakers want some crispy evidence. So some crispy, that is to say numerical evidence, so some impact assessment or their policy, or sometimes they may be asked to fabricate a model that end up with the conclusion that are compatible with the policy someone wants to implement. But you may understand that this actually makes the activity of modeling totally irrelevant in the end, and the activity of quantifying totally relevant. I would like to thank Andrea, to thank the colleague from the Institute for Health and Consumer Protection at the JRC, precisely Jan Bolka, Sandra Caldera, Marguerite Robinson, as well as Roger Stand. And of course, you for your kind attention. I'm looking forward to your feedback and to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Samuele.
So I just want to make one remark. I work in a field of environmental humanities, so there will be a lot of philosophical fluff stuff in my presentation. So sorry for that in advance, and I would like to start. And nuclear disasters, in their specific invisible character, disturb the transmission of knowledge. By examining the situation after two biggest nuclear catastrophes so far, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident and the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, I would like to reflect on the alternative form of knowledge appearing at the time of crisis. Nuclear threats, as one of the precursory varieties of civilization risks, escape the sensual perception and occur in the consciousness of society in the form of chemical physical formulas. Therefore, we're assessing the danger. We are all, including experts, doomed to measuring instruments, theories, and above all, to our ignorance. It is worth noting that when the first attempts were made to use atomic energy, it was experts who provided an infinitely long period of nuclear safety reign, after a few failures related to this type of energy, to continue arguing about the reliability of this solution. In this situation of constant uncertainty, the expert knowledge not only becomes insufficient, but also reveals itself much strongly as a tool of oppressive power. That's why it is important to examine the role of alternative forms of cognize, the post-technological folk knowledge, not only as a way of filling the gaps in perception, but also as a way of opposing the dominant power. I would like to question if maybe, paradoxically, toxicity helped create equality in knowledge and society. The Chernobyl disaster, also referred as the Chernobyl accident, occurred on 26 April 1986 in the number 4 light water graphite moderated reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near Pripyat. As a result of this event, thousands of people were evacuated from the Chernobyl and Pripyat area, and the radioactive cloud covers the vast area of almost the entire continent. From the very beginning of the event, the main voices heard was the propagandist voices of experts. The using of this figure in the Soviet power was an attempt to provide public reassurance in the presented information. Analysis of the collected text indicates that the proverbial expert was only an element of authorizing the published relations. She or he was deprived of his or her own subjectivized voice. The reference of specialists gave the impression that the situation of a possible threat of radioactive contamination is under close and continuous control. The published experts' opinion did not include in the 1986 specific references to the condition of contamination of the area after the accident itself. However, continuous opinions about the decreasing level of radioactivity were presented. Similarly, the exact level of contamination at a given moment was hardly ever precisely determined, without allowing the recipients to verify the information themselves. Attempts to make an independent judgment of the situation were additionally hampered by the very nature of the threat, inexhaustible contamination induced by radioactive radiation. To state that the disaster took place, expert knowledge was necessary. However, due to the fact that it was controlled by the authorities, full recognition of the threat, as in the case of information on the accident itself at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, became impossible. In spite of this, the scale of threat indicated that the control over the transmission of knowledge ceased to belong only to political power. Apart from the central discourse on the subject of the catastrophe, alternative stories created by society itself began to appear almost immediately. These peripheral areas of discourse were revealed in official publications that would urge people not to trust circulating rumors, unverified information, or home methods of protection against radioactive radiation. Calls to strictly follow the recommendation issued by experts did not bring about the desired results. It shows how little real causative power and ability to convince the public that the presented information was right did the communist media have. It can even be said that the official center was separated from this social reality, which was revealed in the marginalized areas of the discourse. As the Polish researcher Marcin Arpikowski notes, the phenomenon such as gossip of conspiracy theories, unusual, controversial events express the struggle for the right to interpret the accident between the cultural periphery and the center that has control over the reality. So, paradoxically, in the case of Chernobyl accident, lacking clear and reliable information about the catastrophe allowed to some extent the autonomy of collective subject and the opposition to totalitarian power. The process of emancipation of the undermediated voice was continued after 1989 in the narratives concerning the catastrophe in the Soviet power plant. The democratization of knowledge caused the coherent and uniform expert body to disappear, being replaced by the multitude of specialized voices, very often presenting contradictory information. It also contributed to the fact that suddenly every human being could become an expert on the subject discussed. As Ulrich Beck points out, this phenomenon is characteristic to modern societies, constantly functioning in the shadow of upcoming catastrophe. It causes a breakdown between social and scientific rationality, causing the end of monopoly of expert knowledge. In the failure in Ukrainian power plant undermined the credibility of mass media in Soviet Union, which was already weak by the end of the 80s, the media playing a leading role during the disaster. It was through the media channel that the public learned about the state of contamination and received information on how to protect themselves against radioactive radiation. In addition, the media from various countries was building different images of the world of the disaster, which were often mutually exclusive. Failure revealed not only the unreliability of technology itself, which was perceived as the top of the achievements of the modern state, but also deprived social trust from experts, whose image was now so intensely used by communist propaganda. The division of discourse into a central one, controlled by the authorities, and peripheral show the weakness of the social mechanism and, above all, the inefficiency of information system. Nowadays, the discourse about the Chernobyl catastrophe lost its center, represented by an expert figure in the communist era, and is now spread to many peripheral stories. Alternative narratives about the disaster began to occupy the main place in shaping the memory of the failure itself. Personal blogs, photo reports, and attempts to explain what happened in April 1986 function as some model of how the disaster itself is remembered. The case of Chernobyl shows what Michel Foucault wrote about, that discourse is not just something that explains the struggles and system of domination, but also for what we fight, the power we are trying to gain. The radiation emanating from Chernobyl was a manifestation of radical invasion of randomness. It is quite as if the normal connection in the chain of cause and effect has been suspended for a moment. The consequences of the explosion are unclear. Experts themselves admitted that the very term of danger threshold was arbitrary. Public opinion wavered between the panic expectation of future disasters and the constant conclusion that there were no reason to get alarmed. Folk knowledge began to be the resistance against the uncertain and oppressive situation. On March 11, 2011, the Pacific coast of the Tohoku region was hit by the earthquake of 9 degrees magnitude. Due to the shock waves, the northeastern part of Japan was affected by tsunami. One of the largest nuclear power plants failed as a result of the cataclysm. In Fukushima Daiichi itself, before 2011, there were 3 major breakdowns. They caused multitude of water and atmospheric contamination in the area of the power plant, but the company, TEPCO, did not inform the public. Relevant reports were published only after the disaster 2011, and their content shocked the Japanese society. This dissonance by the lack of full knowledge about the state of nuclear energy and a subsequent flood of information about its inadequate functioning has significantly affected the response of the Japanese society to failure. For the Japanese, the accident in Chernobyl became a reference point in understanding and learning about the consequences of power plant disaster. Particularly in matters related to the impact of radioactive radiation on the health of residents of areas around the power plant. A reference to the Soviet power plant and the effects of the radiation became not so much an attempt to link and gain knowledge about the impact of radioactivity, but to reveal the problem of obtaining information about Japanese catastrophe in general. It was in the context of health consequences that the fundamental problem related to the disaster of the Japanese power plant was revealed. The lack of trust in the government's action and the quality of message transmitted. My interlocutors were openly saying that the government was hiding important information on Fukushima Daiichi. Official media played an extremely important role in the first days of tragic events, not only providing information and images from the affected areas, but also forming the experience of the disaster. The passivity and helplessness caused by the media co-experience of the catastrophe intensified the feeling of ignorance and fear. The inability to fully understand was compounded by an unexpectedly quick abandonment of the subject of the nuclear power plant disaster by mass media in Japan. The society ceased to believe in the information provided by media, which began the process of independent search and analysis of data events in Fukushima Daiichi. As a result, various social organizations, such as Fukushima Voices, began to emerge, aiming to collect and publish individual testimonies on March 2011. In the situation of utter silence about the subject and of the destroyed areas in the official media, individual voices and personal story became for the Japanese an important source of understanding of these events, but also for the formation of the event's memory. Another example of the phenomena of creating alternative but in some way institutionalized tales about the catastrophe is information center of nuclear disaster in a village of Shirasaka located in Fukushima prefecture. Its mission is to provide real scientific knowledge about the power plant catastrophe. The narrative in which the center formed itself revealed a lack of confidence in the official information on the course and consequences of the disaster. It also underlines the unusually strong need to learn about this event as an opportunity for correct understanding of what happened in Fukushima. Another attempt to oppose the central discourse in the phenomenon of grassroots organization aimed not only talking about what is happening in power plant, but also seeking to completely stop the use of nuclear energy in Japan. Very often, the NPOs operating in the field of nuclear energy conduct their own research with the risk associated with radioactive radiation, often written by non-scientists. Hence, the scientific discourse mixed with the common knowledge in understanding of folk knowledge, creating a multi-voices about the nuclear crisis. The public debate, the voices of grassroots activists and scientists on whom power is referred to have become equivalent. Discrediting TEPCO's activities and companies linked with the Japanese officials had helped hide numerous irregularities. First of all, mean that the public opinion began to believe research conducted by members of various NPOs, rather than the one presented by the experts in the field of nuclear physics. The event in the Fukushima, contrary to common perception of rather monolithic nature of Japanese society, revealed the existing, but though unarticulated, tensions between the government and the citizens. The disaster transformed ordinary residents into political activists, undermining expert and governmental statements. They also started creating their own truth regarding events of March 2011. Therefore, the local activities of small organizations were incorporated in general social changes in a country in which the value of information provided by the government began to be questioned. The analysis of the case of Chernobyl and Fukushima shows that believing in one specific scientific vision of the disaster presented by experts became impossible. Emerging alternative tales about the threat show the opacity of the existing system of expert knowledge. The specific radioactive folk science not only helps with coping with the danger of pollution, but also has a potential to undermine the regime of knowledge and power. It enables creating the resistance to domination of the world of experts, but also has the potential to change the social and political structures. The radioactive pollution not only makes the borders of countries irrelevant and abstract, but also make possible for the society to take control of their reality. Protests, fears, and screams become a form of resistance, a tool for fighting the oppression of power. The case of nuclear power plant failure shows that scientific knowledge is one of many varieties of knowledge, and it is not more valuable than colloquial one. The authorities created the illusion that knowledge is necessary for man to solve life's problem. However, it only serves the gain to maintain power. It is not the pursuit of the truth, but the ability of subordinated of the world. Invisible characteristic of the risk of the radioactive contamination, which escapes cognition, become the forming force of the new subjectivity. Toxicity gives hope to create a new form of social equality, where knowledge becomes a tool for fighting for freedom. Thank you.